Hey, what's going on, guys? I am the Mystical Green Beanie, and comic book movies are just not a thing I tend to talk about anymore, mainly because everybody else talks about them, and there are YouTube channels that are literally dedicated to that kind of thing, and they're all way bigger than my channel, so I just stopped because, honestly, what possible nuance or food for thought can I bring to the table that's new? Right? That said, I saw James Gunn's Suicide Squad and I wanted to talk about it. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. And before I get into this movie, I can't help but talk about David Ayer's Suicide Squad film, or much rather, Warner Brothers' first venture into making a Suicide Squad film. I have a weird relationship with that movie. Obviously, David Ayer has been very vocal about how the movie that we got in 2016 is most definitely not his movie. That's a weird, studio-fied, corrupted version of the story that he was trying to tell, and it doesn't make sense story-wise at all, because the film, which was originally edited by Lee Smith, who was the editor for movies like Dunkirk, Interstellar, and The Dark Knight, was later re-edited by the studio that put together the trailers for the movie. And that's unfortunate, because I really like David Ayer as a director, and I like when he dances outside of his wheelhouse. You know, I'm in the minority of people who really likes Bright, but with Suicide Squad, I guess you could also say that I'm in the minority of people who really likes the atmosphere and the tone that David Ayer was approaching the DC Universe villains with. He made them feel like, this is probably going to sound weird saying out loud, they felt like criminals. And that was the weird thing that I heard people critique and have a real problem with. But I don't know, I really like the tone and style that David Ayer was using with his version of the Suicide Squad for the same reasons that I like Brian Azzarello and Lee Bermejo's Joker, and Lex Luthor Man of Steel, and Batman Eggplant, which I'm also in the minority for liking. But I don't know, I like when supervillains are creatively approached from the perspective of criminals in the real world. I just think that's a cool idea. This is what gangsters look like, and this is what women who hang out with gangsters look like. But why does Captain Boomerang look like a meth head? He probably does meth, Karen. Motherfucker runs jewel heists with a boomerang. He's clearly not making the best of life choices. Anyways, I say all this to say that when James Gunn was officially brought on board to direct the new Suicide Squad movie, I was a bit let down. And that's not because I dislike James Gunn, far from it. He's one of my favorite directors. He has been ever since Super, but he has a distinctly different creative voice than David Ayer. And as much as I like James Gunn and his more recent films, namely the Guardians of the Galaxy films, especially Volume 2, which, again, I like more than most people, it's one of my favorite MCU films, that's not necessarily what I want from a Suicide Squad movie. Thankfully, however, that's not what we got. James Gunn's Suicide Squad is definitely a continuation of the first movie, but it also exists in a world where things like Superman and the Justice League exist, and this is a world that's somewhat desensitized to the more outrageous comic booky elements of superhero fare, but it's all 100% played straight. And it's also not brushing over the grime and grit that comes with dealing with criminals in a world of superheroes. But with all that said, I also think it's important to note that even though this is technically a sequel, this movie stands on its own very well. This is very much its own entity, and even though this movie does take place in a larger cinematic universe, it could also easily be its own thing. And that's something James Gunn did a great job with in regards to the Guardians of the Galaxy films, and he did that here as well. And it's going to be difficult to not bring up some of James Gunn's past filmography, because this is a quintessential James Gunn film. If you've seen his older movies like Super, PG Porn, Slither, this movie feels like the culmination of all of that. And I think that's really interesting, because while there's certainly a lot of early James Gunn in this movie, you also don't get a lot of the off-the-page comic book stuff like Starro fighting the Suicide Squad and John Cena's Peacemaker and King Shark without Guardians, I don't think. And that's why I feel like this movie, the way in which it exists, is the culmination of James Gunn's career, and I think that's really fascinating. And then there's the minor stuff like the story and the characters and all that. Look, I love this narrative. I love the tone and the visual style that this movie has. In the same way that Scott Pilgrim vs. the World feels like a comic book put to screen, this feels like a comic book put to screen. And I know that's a term that gets thrown around like a community cum rag, but shit like the Avengers, and even Zack Snyder's Justice League and Deadpool, those don't feel like comic books put to screen. At least not to me. Not like this, anyways. Those movies feel like creators taking characters and concepts and translating them to a different medium. This, however, this is a comic book. Like, one of my favorite things about this movie, and it's a minor thing, but it's the little things that count sometimes. I love the title cards for each chapter. This movie is broken up into chapters, and Edgar Wright did this on Twitter, and he's dead on the money. This feels like reading a trade paperback. This feels like a graphic novel. Even visually, there's a 4-color comic palette that this movie is somewhat following, very much like comics of the 1970s and the 1980s. And speaking of which, this very much put me in mind of John Ostrander and Carl Kessel's Suicide Squad run from the 80s. Or, the stuff that I read from it. Which I wasn't expecting going into this. Much like that comic, this movie is very steeped in U.S. foreign policy and the United States government's need to perpetuate the fallacy that it doesn't commit war crimes. The whole premise of this movie is that in the 70s or the 60s or whatever, American astronauts find Starro floating in space, and the U.S. government sends Starro to Corto Maltese, which in the comics is basically not Cuba. And because the island nation isn't hostile towards the United States, they allow the American government to run illegal and unethical experiments on Starro, as well as political prisoners. And there was even a point where my girlfriend leaned over to me and whispered in my ear, this is some Guantanamo Bay type shit. And yeah, she's right. That's exactly what this is. I also love everything with Peacemaker. I loved his character in the movie. He's probably my favorite character of the film, which is interesting because I went in expecting Bloodsport to be my favorite, but it was Peacemaker instead, which I guess that tracks. The comedian's my favorite character in Watchmen, and Peacemaker is the prime inspiration for Eddie Blake when Alan Moore was writing Watchmen. I'm not sure what that says about me, but he's my favorite character. I think his ideology is interesting, where he's dedicated to preserving peace no matter how many people he has to kill to keep it.
And not just the men, but the women and the children too.
But as fucked up as an ideology as that is, in a lot of ways, he's the perfect soldier because of it. And I like how that makes him this sort of dark mirror for both Rick Flag and Bloodsport. Because he's a tool of the U.S. government, much like Rick Flag, but unlike Rick Flag, he doesn't have a conscience, which puts him at odds with Bloodsport, who's also a mercenary, but he isn't lost in ideology. And I was really happy to see that we got a Suicide Squad movie that was about so many of these real-world ideas regarding U.S. foreign policy and the United States imperial PR machine. If I had any gripes, there would only be two. The first being, I love Viola Davis in this movie, and I think she plays Amanda Waller flawlessly, but I call BS on her getting cracked in the head and being betrayed by her analyst team and not disappearing them. Like, Amanda Waller in the comics would never, ever take that lying down. I mean, comics aside, this is the same Amanda Waller from the last Suicide Squad movie, and regardless of how you felt about that film, this is the same woman who smoked her entire analyst team just to tie up loose ends. So yeah, that was one of those things that felt out of character for me. And the second gripe, and this isn't just limited to this movie, it's a problem that I have with the comics and video games and other movies and TV shows as well. Harley Quinn is OP. And I know that there are some people out there who hate that she's on the Suicide Squad at all. I don't necessarily have that problem. The whole point of the Suicide Squad is that it's a grab bag of random villains with a few mainstays here and there, but Harley is just some chick. I mean, yeah, she's a gymnast, but, like, clearing 3 whole-ass rooms of military-trained armed guards?
Whack.
But then again, that just goes back to my problem with Batman and Batman-adjacent characters. Like, would Batman really be able to solo the entire Justice League? And why is Joker treated like the ultimate supervillain boogeyman? This is a problem with me inherently, and it's just one of those things where the movie is adapting the source material properly, I just don't like the source material that it's adapting. But yeah, in the end, I really enjoyed this movie. A buddy of mine said that this is his single favorite superhero, or I guess supervillain movie of all time. I don't think I'll go that far. I don't think I can go that far. But I do like this movie a lot. It's definitely in my top 10, and it's a real shame that this movie isn't doing well at the box office, but I'm not really all that surprised. First and foremost, there's still a global pandemic going on. This is also a rated R film, and on top of that, just calling a spade, this doesn't have the Marvel logo attached to it, so it stands without reason that this movie wasn't going to do nearly as well as something like Black Widow or Spider-Man Halfway Home. But it's definitely worth checking out. I wish I saw this in theaters because this movie is very big, especially when you get to the third act when the Suicide Squad fights Starro. This is a movie that demands to be seen on the big screen. And between this and Zack Snyder's Justice League, I hope Warner Brothers finally gets the idea that if you just let a director do the thing that they're hired to do, you'll end up with a decent movie. But yeah, I really enjoyed this film, but what about you? Let me know down below in the comments section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share it, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, adios.